time to hit the road. Get ready to turn left. Turn left.
Good evening, everyone. This is John Tabb with the Peterbilt 389. Happy graduation to the class of 2025 tomorrow. And for those of you already graduated, so let's go for a ride in this truck as we begin with Fresno, California. And this will be Texas Town for you guys. So, let's go for a ride, everyone.
Keep left, and then turn left. Turn left. You have arrived at your destination. Your route guidance is now finished. Drive safe. Turn left. left, and then turn left. Turn left. Keep right, and then turn right. Turn right.
Waters to irrigated deserts in states downstream. The main water agency in Las Vegas sent $800,000 to Utah's program because precipitation there feeds the Colorado River, which fills Las Vegas's main reservoir. Andrew Rickard runs cloud seeding for the state of Colorado.
Let's put some real science and money behind this and show people that we can increase our water in a safe and efficient manner.
Experts caution that cloud seeding is not a panacea. They say ultimately to deal with droughts, climate change, and poor planning around the use of Colorado River water, people have to think about conserving water. While research shows it's safe to release silver iodide into the atmosphere in the amounts used by cloud seeders, people like Utah's Jonathan Jennings face harassment from people with conspiracy theories about the government controlling the weather or poisoning the air.
They were death threats. Most of it was general harassment, but there were death threats and threat of doxing as well. In fact, they were successful.
Jennings said he's sticking with it in spite of the harassment. For NPR News, I'm Alex Hager in Ogden, Utah.
And in Houston, it's 5:48 on All Things Considered here on your NPR station, News 88.7. 90 degrees with heat index of 96 right now here at the UH campus. I'm Dick Pittman. Out on the freeway, still have the wreck investigation northbound 45 right at Cypress Wood. All main lanes shut down, reopening after Spring Cypress. The Hardy, of course, would be your alternate there. Westbound 290 at Huffmeister, still have a wreck in the left lane, and southbound 69 heading out Southwest Freeway. The wreck at Kirby is cleared. Now a bit farther down, we have a car fire cleanup at Fountain View.
Houston Public Media is rooted in our community. We show up at school board meetings, city council votes, and neighborhood events.
That's how you stay informed about what's happening around you through deep local reporting that brings clarity and insight.
Your support powers this public service, so Greater Houston stays informed, connected, and safe.
Support local journalism right now at houstonpublicmedia.org/donate or call 888-909-0887.
Support for Houston Public Media comes from Specs, celebrating and focusing on tequila for sipping, margaritas, and more throughout the month of May. Recipes and more at specsonline.com. The fun starts here.
Support comes from Broadway Bank's commercial banking team. Since 1941, committed to helping businesses with their financial needs and growth. More information available at broadway.bank/commercial. Member FDIC.
Support for Houston Public Media comes from Holocaust Museum Houston, featuring Ilan Ramon, A Life and Legacy, the story of the first Israeli astronaut. Exhibit opening and reception on May 29th. Details at hmh.org. Support for Houston Public Media comes from Upreach Learning, presenting a summer academic boot camp for high school students to prepare for core STEM classes or the SAT exam. Camps begin June 2nd. Registration info at upreachlearning.org.
This is All Things Considered from NPR News. I'm Ari Shapiro.
And I'm Mary Louise Kelly. All in all, it was awful, but it could have been worse. That's how one South African newspaper summed up President Cyril Ramaphosa's extraordinary Oval Office meeting with President Trump on Wednesday. Trump used the meeting to repeat right-wing conspiracy theories with false claims about a, quote, genocide of white South Africans. The showdown at the White House was a prime time event in South Africa, as Kate Bartlett reports now from Johannesburg.
It's all anyone in South Africa is talking about.
Okay, so there's so many calls, so I want to ask you guys to just be patient with us because there are a lot of calls that are coming through. So if you...
The day after what many are calling the ambush at the White House, the phones at local talk radio station 702 didn't stop ringing. Host Clement Manyatela, who was among the South African journalists in Washington covering the Oval Office meeting, had this main takeaway.
President Cyril Ramaphosa has to be given props for being so calm. This could have escalated quickly.
Ramaphosa was one of Nelson Mandela's key negotiators in the talks that ended apartheid, so he has some experience with heated debate. Most callers, who only use their first names on this radio show, agreed he kept his cool despite Trump's repeated false claims, but the Oval Office scene left others fuming.
Why should we go there and dehumanize and debase ourselves?
Asked Mandla from Midrand.
He was not going to listen to any black man, let's be honest about it.
Said a caller named Sister about Trump. During the meeting, Ramaphosa repeatedly tried to explain the facts, which are that the South African government is not expropriating white-owned land and there is no genocide of white people. At a local coffee shop in Johannesburg, customers had assumed Trump would try to humiliate their president.
Arrogant, misinformed, in his tone, in the way he addresses things.
That's 29-year-old fashion designer Ernest Motsi and 42-year-old barista Sia Rallo agreed.
We all know that Trump wants to dominate and embarrass other world leaders.
But there were other South Africans who welcomed Trump's remarks about the alleged persecution of white farmers, including Kali Kriel, who heads Afrikaner rights lobby group AfriForum.
President Ramaphosa and his government now has a choice. They can continue on this road of denialism, or they can decide to lead the country out of this crisis.
International and local media have been fact-checking Trump's Oval Office claims. One article he brandished, claiming it was about violence in South Africa, was actually about the Democratic Republic of Congo. The South African leader kept his cool throughout, as reporter Anika Larson noted at a press briefing Ramaphosa held later that day.
Mr. President, I just wanted to say I don't know if you drink alcohol, but if you do, you deserve a stiff whiskey.
And Mandela's chief negotiator joked back.
Give that man a bells.
For NPR News, I'm Kate Bartlett in Johannesburg.
The new novel, The Book of Records, begins when a 7-year-old girl named Lena arrives with her father in a place called the Sea, S-E-A.
It's buildings that are a way station for people who are fleeing one place and trying to make a home elsewhere. And usually people just stay there for a day or two, enough to touch land, and then begin their journey again.
Author Madeline Tien told me she wanted to set her novel in a place that is not a natural home, somewhere different centuries might converge. 3 historical figures eventually enter the story. They come from different places and different eras.
There were many people I hoped would come and accompany Lena and her father. Her father only takes 3 books off the shelf. They have to leave in a hurry. He grabs 3 books that he tells her looked like the most unread, the ones that might withstand 1,000 readings, something that maybe she would be able to live within for a longer amount of time. And they happen to be these three: Hannah Arendt, Baruch Spinoza, and the Chinese poet Du Fu, all from different centuries. And I chose them because they were thinkers I had lived with for a long time, who had taken root in me, and probably their ideas had flowed through me in ways I could see and couldn't see. And I know when I wrote it, I wanted to face what those ideas meant, or what I thought, what I believed I had learned, or what I believed I had inherited in some sense.
These three people from different centuries each faced authoritarianism, betrayal, societal collapse. And I've heard you say that all three of them still tried to hold on to love for the world. What do you think the secret is to holding on to love for the world in the face of all of that?
I almost think it's a necessity. You know, there's a famous Hannah Arendt line, you know, why is it so hard to love this world? But this world is also our only home, our deepest belonging. And so to face what we are within it, what it gives us, what it brings us, how it shapes us, I think all three understood that if they were going to preserve what was most dear to them, to hold everything dear, they had to love it first before knowing how to survive it as well.
Does that come naturally to you, or is one of the reasons you turn to these writers and thinkers so often is that they have been able to do something you struggle to do?
I think you've named it, yes. I think that is the gift they gave me. In the 9 years of writing this book, it really taught me how to perceive differently, and it was demanding in terms of the thinking that went into it, and the grappling with their ideas, their work, their philosophies, their questions, and also where they hit contradictions. There was a gift of thinking with them that also brought me to another kind of love of our world across time.
As you mentioned, you spent almost a decade writing this book, and the world has changed a lot in that decade. One way it's changed is that authoritarian governments around the world have gained power, democracy has receded. And so as you wrote these stories of people who lived in eras of history where that was the case, where authoritarianism was on the rise, what did you learn about the world that we're living in right now?
You know, Spinoza's most famous work is Ethics, the Ethics, this sort of exploration of the consequences about human freedom and free will, and perhaps some of the illusions of those things, but also what it means to have a moral life, what it means to choose, what it means to observe how we respond to things. And I think what I carried from these three is not that there is a moral person. It's never a fixed state of being. It's about choices, and everyone has a choice at every moment to speak, to not speak, to protect another, to look away, to hold something dear, to not hold things dear. And I think that's what they gave me, is the recognition that at every moment there is a choice to be made.
Madeleine Tien's new novel is The Book of Records. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
This is NPR News.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from RBC Wealth Management, where financial advisors work to understand individual goals and are dedicated to providing customized advice to help strengthen financial security. More at rbcwealthmanagement.com. From Progressive Insurance with Snapshot, which monitors safe driving habits to determine a personalized rate. At progressive.com, not available in California or from all agents.
And then
From Workday. Workday is an AI platform for forward thinkers, dedicated to transforming the way business leaders manage people and money today so they can transform tomorrow. Workday, moving business forever forward. And from listeners like you, who donate to this NPR station.
It's a minute before 6 on the day before Friday on All Things Considered here on your NPR station, News 88.7. Heading out on the Southwest Freeway, southbound 69. Still have the car fire cleanup happening at Fountain View. Westbound 290, that'll take you about 45 minutes to get from the West Loop to Highway 6. Got a wreck with poor Huffmeister in the left lane. And the big one of the afternoon, northbound 45, all lanes shut down at Parramatta for the investigation into a fatal wreck. It reopens after Spring Cypress. And, of course, the Hardy would be your alternate.
Support comes from Baylor College of Medicine, creating tomorrow's medicine today. Known for their medical research and innovation, Baylor College of Medicine is a proud sponsor of Houston Matters with Craig Cohen, Monday through Friday at 9 a.m. on News 88.7.
We have 90 with a heat index of 96 right now here at the UH campus. And this is your NPR station, KUHF Houston News 88.7, service of the University of Houston at 6 o'clock.
She joined the embassy shortly after October 7th, after she felt a high rise of anti-Semitism around her.
More on the victims of the shooting last night at the Jewish Museum.
Today is Thursday, May 22nd, and this is All Things Considered from NPR News. I'm Mary Louise Kelly.
And I'm Ari Shapiro. Coming up, California can set its own air pollution rules that are stricter than national standards.
Senate Republicans just took an extraordinary step to revoke that right.
I think they're somewhat frantic at the prospect of losing this Green New Deal policy.
Also, national parks will be understaffed this summer. What should you know before you visit?
Remember to be nice. The staff that you do see are going to be working their tails off. Tell them thanks for being there.
Plus, the Supreme Court deadlocks on religious charter schools.
First, this news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Jack Spear. The Trump administration is revoking Harvard's ability to enroll international students. NPR's Alyssa Nadworny reports details were sent in a letter to the school from the Department of Homeland Security.
The letter, signed by Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem, says the administration is terminating Harvard's student exchange certification. That prevents Harvard from enrolling new students and pulls the rug out from under currently enrolled international students. In a statement, Noem says the administration is holding Harvard accountable for, quote, fostering violence, anti-Semitism, and coordinating with the Chinese Communist Party. Harvard says the government's actions are, quote, unlawful. The university has nearly 7,000 international students, roughly 1/4 of the student body. More than 1 million international students study at U.S. colleges and universities, contributing more than $43 billion to the U.S. economy. Alyssa Nadworny, NPR News.
One of the victims of a fatal shooting in Washington, D.C. last night grew up in a Kansas suburb and was an active member of her Jewish community there. Reporter Salisu Kawalko from Kansas City has more.
Police say a gunman shot and killed Sarah Milgram and Yaron Lishinsky outside the Capitol Jewish Museum. The couple met at work at the Israeli embassy, and they were on the verge of getting engaged. Milgram, who was 26, grew up in Prairie Village, Kansas. Her father, Robert Milgram, told KCUR he thinks education is important to stopping these acts of violence.
Many different people living in the U.S., there's no reason to hate one another. This hate cannot divide us. We need to overcome it.
The temple where Sarah worshipped said in a statement that her commitment to Judaism was deeply personal and described her as a radiant presence. For NPR News, I'm Salisa Kalakal in Kansas City.
Shares of the mortgage giants Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac hit their highest levels since 2008. That's after President Trump posted he may take them public. As NPR's Chris Arnold reports, that could make a lot of money for some big investors who are allies of the president.
Fannie and Freddie are the most powerful forces in the multi-trillion-dollar U.S. mortgage market. And they've been prisoners of the Treasury Department ever since their bad investments forced a government bailout during the 2008 crash. So President Trump is basically talking about letting Fannie and Freddie out of jail. But a former official tells NPR that there's a way to do that where investors that hold the old Fannie and Freddie stock get wiped out, and another way to do it where those investors would make billions. The biggest holder of that old stock is reported to be Bill Ackman, a backer of President Trump. Taking Fannie and Freddie public would also be complicated, and if done wrong, it could cause turmoil in the stock and bond markets. Chris Arnold, NPR News.
On Wall Street, stocks ended the session on a mixed note. The Dow was down a point. The Nasdaq closed up 53 points. The S&P 500 rose 2 points. You're listening to NPR.
Live from News 88.7 in Houston, I'm Gail DeLauder.
With days left before the start of hurricane season, NOAA's out with its latest forecast. News 88.7's Gabrielle Dawkins says people are encouraged to prepare for severe storms this year.
Every Category 5 storm that's ever hit this country was a tropical storm or less 3 days prior.
Ken Graham, the director of the National Weather Service, says that NOAA is forecasting an above-average season.
For the range of storms, we're calling for 13 to 19 named storms. Of these, 6 to 10 are forecast to become hurricanes, and 3 to 5 is the number of major hurricanes. That's Cat 3 and above, with maximum sustained winds of 111 miles an hour or greater.
Graham says they are equipped with the best forecast models that they've ever had. He encourages everyone to stock up on needed supplies ahead of hurricane season. I'm Gabrielle Dawkins, News 88.7.
Overtime spending in the police and fire departments could pose problems for the city of Houston's budget in the upcoming fiscal year. News 88.7's Dominic Anthony Walsh has more.
The city budgeted about $60 million for police and fire overtime, but it spent more than $120 million. Firefighters Union President Marty Langton blames staffing shortages, going back to contract disputes with former Mayor Sylvester Turner.
So the Houston Fire Department is a demand service, and if you don't have the personnel to respond to the citizens on their worst day, you've got nobody to get to them.
The city is budgeting $58 million for police and fire overtime in the next fiscal year, which starts in July. That's a drop from the 2025 budget. The department chiefs say new contracts approved under Mayor John Whitmire will help bring in new recruits. I'm Dominic Anthony Walsh, News 88.7.
Gas prices are up ahead of the holiday weekend. AAA Texas says the statewide average is $2.79 a gallon. That's 5 cents more than last week. The Astros play the Seattle Mariners at Digan Park tonight. First pitch is just after 7. Overnight low should be around 76 degrees. For tomorrow, partly cloudy skies, high near 94. I'm Gail DeLauder, News 88.7.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Sony Pictures Classics, presenting Jane Austen Wrecked My Life, a romantic comedy about a woman who dreams of becoming a writer and experiencing true love while attending a Jane Austen writer's residency. Opens in select cities Friday.
On a Thursday, it's All Things Considered from NPR News. I'm Mary Louise Kelly.
And I'm Ari Shapiro. This afternoon, a suspect was charged in the killing of 2 people outside a Jewish museum here in Washington. He faces several counts, including 2 of first-degree murder of a foreign official, and gun charges. President Trump has called the attack an act of anti-Semitism. NPR's Odette Youssef and Jennifer Ludden are covering this story, and here with the latest. Hi there.
Hi. Hi.
Jennifer, to begin with, what did police say happened?
Well, there was an event for young diplomats at the Capitol Jewish Museum downtown. It was hosted by the American Jewish Committee, and police say the suspect had been pacing outside the museum, and then after the event, around 9 o'clock last night, he targeted a group of 4 people and shot dead 2 of them. They say he then ran into the museum and was detained.
Israel's ambassador to the U.S. has said that the 2 people killed both worked at the embassy here. He said they were a young couple about to be engaged. What more can you tell us about them?
Yes, Yaron Lishinsky was 30. He was a research assistant at the embassy. Sarah Lynn Milgram was 26, and she organized trips to Israel. The ambassador said Lishinsky had bought a ring and planned to propose next week on a trip to Jerusalem. Now, Lishinsky's family had spent time in Germany. He had both German and Israeli citizenship. Friends say he was actually a devout Christian. In a social media post in 2021, he wrote that Israel's the only place in the Middle East where Christians can thrive. I spoke with a friend of Sarah Milgram's, someone who knew her through the embassy here in D.C. Israeli attorney Ayelet Rezin Bet-Or has been researching sexual violence during the Hamas attack on Israel. That was on October 7th, 2023, and Milgram coordinated her U.S. presentations. She says Milgram was charming, she was always smiling, she'd light up a room, and that she saw a serious role for herself when she chose a job in diplomacy.
Sarah told me that she joined the embassy shortly after October 7th, after she felt a high rise of anti-Semitism around her, unlike anything she experienced before.
Rezin Bet-Or calls it a really painful irony that Milgram died in the kind of anti-Semitic attack that she was struggling to combat.
Odette, turning to you. You went to the Chicago neighborhood this morning where the suspect is believed to live. What did you see?
Yeah, Ari, this is, a leafy, quiet residential side street in a neighborhood on the northwest side of Chicago. It's a very diverse area with lots of Mexican, Middle Eastern, and Asian establishments nearby. This is an area of the city with lots of families with kids, near the Chicago train stop. The building is a red brick multi-unit building. When I got there, I actually walked right up to the entryway, and here's a sense of what I was seeing. And you can hear in this the helicopters that were buzzing overhead. I'm at the address listed as the subjects. In the windows of the first floor apartment, there are political signs. There's also a sign in one of the windows to the right with a picture of a small boy, and under it, it says, "Justice for Wadia." Wadia, that's referring to Wadia Al-Fayumi, a 6-year-old Palestinian-American child in south suburban Chicago. You'll recall, Ari, he was stabbed to death by his landlord in a hate crime a week after the October 7th attack by Hamas on Israel. There were other posters in the window, one for the local council member who's with the Democratic Socialists of America, another one saying "ceasefire now," and some other leftist messaging. And basically, as soon as I snapped a picture, an FBI agent rushed me away because then half a dozen black Suburbans suddenly came down the block, stopped, and agents in full tactical gear got out and went into the unit.
Did you learn anything about the suspect himself?
Most of what we know so far has come from court documents. They say that he purchased the 9mm gun in Illinois 5 years ago and had it in his checked luggage when he flew from Chicago to D.C. the day before the attack. In an interview with police, he expressed admiration for an individual who had set himself on fire in protest of the war and called that individual, quote, a martyr. The FBI says they're examining some online writings that may be connected to the suspect. I've looked through some of those. There are posts that embrace political violence, one of them suggesting to bomb a journalism outlet, another one saying death to Israel, and reposts of videos featuring the former leader of the militant anti-Israel group Hezbollah. But again, we haven't confirmed that these are his accounts. He has no criminal record prior to this that we could find, so still lots of questions.
Reporting there from NPR's Odette Youssef and Jennifer Ludden. Thank you both.
Thank you.
To other news today, the Senate has just voted to revoke California's right to require companies to sell more electric vehicles. And California has a unique ability to set air pollution rules that are stricter than the national standards. And the way that lawmakers voted today is controversial. It went against the advice of their own parliamentarian. NPR's Camilla Dominowski joins me to talk about this development, this major development in the EV policy battle. Hey there.
Hi, Bailey.
Tell me a little bit more about what current California EV policy is.
Yeah, the policy that's really at the heart of this debate here requires car makers to sell more zero-emission vehicles. More than a third of new sales starting in the next model year, all the way up to 100% of new cars being zero-emission. EVs, basically, by 2035. California is the only state that can set its own rules like this, and that's because they've been regulating air pollution for so long, but other states can choose to follow California. And it's also important that every time California makes a rule like this, which they've done many times, they need permission from the Environmental Protection Agency, a waiver. This particular waiver was granted under the Biden administration, and now Congress has voted to reverse it.
Walk us through the stakeholders here. Who stands to lose? Who stands to gain?
Well, the oil industry and traditional automakers are big winners here. Both of those industries have called California's mandate unfair and unfeasible and lobbied very hard against it. This is also a win for anyone who says that these kinds of rules deprive consumers of choices by shaping what cars companies are able to sell. On the other side, California is a global leader in the push to fight climate change. And environmental groups say that dismantling the EV requirement undermines that, which affects everybody. And then public health groups say emission standards save human lives through cleaner air, which is a local impact that's big in California. Revoking these EPA waivers would be a blow to those health goals.
Okay, so sounds like there's a debate over that Congress did this at all. There's also a debate over how they did this. Explain.
Yeah, Congress used a law called the Congressional Review Act, or the CRA, which allows lawmakers to undo rules from agencies with a simple majority vote. No filibustering is allowed. And the question is an EPA waiver a rule? The parliamentarian, Congress's in-house rules interpreter for the Senate, said no, it's not a rule, so the CRA doesn't apply. Her guidance is non-binding, but it's extremely rare to disregard it. And in this case, the Senate did. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said that this busts norms and that expands the use of the CRA in a way that gives more power to the majority, which he said Republicans might regret the next time Democrats are in power.
Republicans should tread very carefully today. What goes around comes around.
Now, Republicans say that Congress is acting within its rights here, and Senate Majority Leader John Thune said he doesn't buy that Democrats are really upset about procedures.
I think they're somewhat frantic at the prospect of losing this Green New Deal policy.
So, Camila, what comes next?
Well, President Trump is expected to sign this. This is a major priority for him. California officials have said they will challenge it in court, which will be interesting because the CRA says that it is not subject to judicial review.
And PR's Camila Dominowski, thank you.
Thank you.
Memorial Day weekend kicks off a busy few months for the country's national parks. Visitors descend on national treasures stretching from Acadia National Park in Maine all the way to Volcanoes National Park in Hawaii and lots of others in between.
People go during the summer. Any other time, these parks are more or less empty.
That is Graham Averill. He covers the national parks for Outside Magazine. He says this year it is not just the weather that's changing, park staffing levels are too.
People need to be prepared to not have the front country help that they're used to having.
That's because there are fewer people working for the National Park Service today than at the start of the Trump administration.
The National Parks Conservancy Association estimates that the Park Service has lost 13% of its workforce since January through deferred resignations, buyouts, and early retirements. That's about 2,500 fewer employees. Averill says he's already seen the effects.
So I went to the Smokies recently for a hike. It's an area that I've been to many times, as a little ranger station, has a bathroom, and a handful of trails that branch off from a campground. The campground was closed. It's not going to open this summer. The bathrooms were closed. They're not going to open this summer. The trails are still open, but there wasn't a ranger for me to talk to. There wasn't a bathroom for me to visit before my hike.
Averill says no park will be totally closed this summer, and people should still plan to go. They'll just need to adjust their expectations.
Maybe the visitor center isn't open for as many hours, or maybe there's a longer line at the entrance station, right?
He also warns that food concession stands may be shut down, so visitors should plan to bring their own food and take their own trash out of the park.
And yes, it could be hard to get a camping site inside a national park this year, but Averill says you still have options.
Most of our national parks are surrounded by either national forest land or Bureau of Land Management property. And so while you may not be able to find a campsite inside the national park, there's a good chance you can find one just outside the national park in a very similar landscape.
So plan ahead. And if you do visit a national park this summer, Averill has this advice.
Kind of remember to be nice. The staff that you do see are going to be working their tails off. Be nice to them. Tell them thanks for being there.
Some helpful tips there from Graham Averill. He covers the national parks for Outside Magazine.
And what a lovely world we live in when you have to remind people to just show basic common courtesy and respect. But this is a place we'll always be nice to you. It's News 88.7, 6:17 on the clock, 90 Fahrenheit, 32 Celsius, heat index of 96 and 36 respectively. I'm David Pittman, out on the freeway, southbound 69, heading out Southwest Freeway. The car fire cleanup at Fountain View has wrapped up. All lanes are back open. Westbound 290, that's about 40 minutes now to get from the West Loop to Highway 6. The wreck before Huffmeister is still with us in the left lane. Northbound 69, we've got a stall right before the downtown Spur. Center lane ticket up there. And northbound 45, all lanes still shut down at Parramatta for the investigation into a fatal wreck. Reopening after Spring Cypress. It's going to be solid after Rankin. And, of course, the Hardy would be your best alternate.
You count on Houston Public Media because you understand how important a free press is to a healthy society.
We're not chasing ratings. We're not owned by a corporation. We're here to inform you with facts, context, and clarity.
When you give today, you're helping protect journalism that serves you, not a political agenda or a bottom line.
Support this public service now at houstonpublicmedia.org/donate or call 888-909-0887.
Home sales usually start heating up this time of year. This year, though, it's a bit cooler. The spring housing market next time on Marketplace.
Coming your way in 10 minutes on News 88.7.
Support comes from John Moore, helping with plumbing, electrical, and air conditioning repairs, including out-of-warranty units since 1965. Details at 730-2525 or at johnmooreservices.com. Support comes from Chariot Energy, delivering a range of electricity options for Texas businesses, large and small, offering custom plans for large businesses and web portal access for the entrepreneurs. Details at chariotenergy.com.
Support comes from Rice University's Baker Institute, offering a forum for informed, nonpartisan, civic-minded engagement on the most pressing issues facing Texas, the U.S., and the world. More information about becoming a member is at bakerinstitute.org/membership.
We'll have a bit of patchy fog overnight, low of 75, sunny tomorrow, and a high near 94. It's 6:20.
Support for NPR comes from the station and from the Wallace Foundation, an independent, nonpartisan research foundation collaborating with grantees and partners in the arts, school leadership, and youth development. More at wallacefoundation.org. From Jarl and Pamela Moan, focusing on civil liberties, foster youth, public radio, and the arts. And from the William T. Grant Foundation, supporting research to improve the lives of young people at wtgrantfdn.org.
This is All Things Considered from NPR News. I'm Mary Louise Kelly.
And I'm Ari Shapiro. In the span of one recent week, federal prosecutors charged 4 non-U.S. citizens with illegal voting. President Trump, Elon Musk, and other Republicans have been fixated on the idea of non-citizens voting in large numbers in U.S. elections. NPR's Miles Parks and Jude Joffe-Block have been looking into these cases and what the charges mean for the ongoing debate around voting restrictions. Hey there.
Hey, Ari.
Hello.
Miles, to start with you, who got arrested, and do these cases bolster the argument Republicans are making about voter fraud?
They do not seem to. I mean, for over a year, Trump and Musk have insisted that the Biden administration was letting migrants without legal status into the United States to vote for Democrats. There's never been evidence of that, and there's never been evidence that non-citizens vote in American elections at anything but microscopic numbers. One of the cases, the man has been here for more than a decade, and he actually seems to be a big Trump supporter. In other court documents, he's on the record as calling Trump the greatest man of our times. In another, a mother and a daughter were in the U.S. legally. They were green card holders, but they told a federal investigator they didn't realize that meant they couldn't also vote. And I should also note they have both pleaded not guilty.
Does intent and knowledge matter for illegal voting?
The statute does not specify that you have to know voting was illegal. And sure, there are some isolated cases of intentional voter fraud, but I talked with Professor Benji Cover, who's at the University of Idaho, and his work has found that a lot of non-citizen cases are actually voter mistakes and not fraud. And he says when you conflate the two things, the policy solutions for responding to them are really different.
When you start with this very heated political rhetoric and this false premise that there's this just massive widespread voter fraud, that suggests a very different set of solutions that involves making it much, much harder for everybody to register and much, much harder for everybody to vote.
Cover told me he's worried that these isolated few arrests are going to be used to justify new voting restrictions.
Well, let me ask about that. There has been a huge push for stricter voting rules over the last few years. Jude, is there any evidence that these recent arrests are moving the needle even more?
Well, yeah, it's worth noting that the timing of these 4 arrests is coming right in the middle of a national policy debate about whether Americans should have to show proof of citizenship to register to vote, like a passport or a birth certificate. Republicans in Congress are pushing the SAVE Act, which would require that. The bill passed the House. It's before the Senate now. President Trump is also seeking to enact these restrictions by executive order. And almost half of all states considered legislation this session to add proof of citizenship requirements for voter registration, and a few recently passed laws.
In these cases, authorities also credited DOJ, the Department of Government Efficiency, with helping in some of the arrests. What role did Elon Musk's team play here?
Right. The Secretary of Homeland Security and Justice Department both credited DOJ in some of these arrests, but neither agency gave us more details about what that meant. But people affiliated with DOJ have publicly said that they're comparing Social Security data to state voter rolls to try to find potential non-citizens who voted. And they told reporters recently they've referred dozens of these cases to federal law enforcement, but we've only seen this handful so far. We did hear from White House spokesperson Liz Houston, who told us anyone who says non-citizen voting isn't a problem is, quote, delusional and lying. The White House also pointed to a few dozen other cases of non-citizens voting going back to 2011.
But a few dozen cases over more than a decade compared to the hundreds of millions of votes cast in recent elections would seem to be a tiny fraction.
Yeah, I mean, we know Trump and many on the right use these sort of anecdotes to drive the idea that more requirements are necessary for everyone, even though research has shown these sort of requirements could make voting significantly harder for as many as 1 in 10 eligible Americans.
And what's interesting, we talked with Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson about this. She's a Democrat, and she recently audited her state's election for 2024 and found that fewer than 20 non-citizens voted out of the more than 5 million votes that were cast. She referred those cases to law enforcement and said she's supportive of the government doing more on the back end to try to get non-citizens off of the voter rolls, but she doesn't want those burdens passed on to voters on the front end. Benson said she wants the government to use a scalpel to address this problem, not a sledgehammer.
That's NPR's Miles Parks and Jude Joffe-Block. Thank you both.
Thanks, Ari.
Thank you.
House Republicans approved the reconciliation bill, which includes unprecedented cuts to the largest feeding program in the nation. The Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, stands to lose nearly $300 billion if the bill passes the Senate. Texas Public Radio's Paul Flav talked to people who will be most affected by the potential cuts.
Turn right.
Looking out from under his bald cap with the words Marines stitched across the bill, Richard Maldonado's eyes are tired. He got to this parking lot on San Antonio's southwest side at 4 a.m. for a food bank distribution. It doesn't start until 9, but he says he didn't want to miss out.
Without them, we'd be in bad shape.
Sitting next to him, Karina Gutierrez says her SNAP dollars, which she still calls food stamps, are running out more quickly, and they have to rely even more on the San Antonio Food Bank.
We get the stamps once a month, and before we know it, by almost 2 weeks, we're out of food.
The couple are in their 60s and 70s. Maldonado worries there will be less food to go around if the government cuts SNAP, and they will have to turn to family for help.
We're gonna be depending on people like donating money or food or whatever. It's gonna come down to that.
Up ahead, teams of volunteers cut open 50-pound bags of white onions. Next to them, volunteers rush to break down pallets of limes, canned green beans, broccoli, and yellow squash.
Squash going into this bag, so you're just gonna keep on filling up squash.
More than 250 cars are already in line for food, and more keep showing up.
As the administration moves towards budget reconciliation, we have less food in our warehouse to serve lines like this.
San Antonio Food Bank CEO Eric Cooper says his organization has lost $8 million in federal funding in Trump's first 100 days. SNAP helped more than 41 million people afford food in an average month in 2024, according to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, a nonpartisan research institute. If the spending bill ends up passing in the Senate, the center warns that expanded work requirements would strip food assistance from millions of Americans, and food banks would have to step in to bridge the gap.
The trickle down will be rationing. I'll take the food that we have here at the distribution, cut it in half, and then basically give families less.
The reconciliation bill requires the states to pay a portion of the food benefit costs for the first time. And Northwestern University economist Diane Schanzenbach says if the U.S. sinks into a recession, states with shrinking revenues and must-balance budgets won't be able to afford it.
We'd be setting up a situation where just when people are most needing SNAP benefits, they're hardest to get.
Back at the food distribution, the line is moments away from moving. Jesse Monseves says every little bit helps for people like him.
And you go to the store, you get 2 bags, that's already like $50. You ain't got nothing in them.
Go straight on.
I think these lines are gonna get longer if they cut everything.
Lines of cars filled with hungry people that may end up getting less food. For NPR News, I'm Paul Flav in San Antonio.
It's coming up on 6:29, and you've been listening to All Things Considered on your NPR station, News 88.7. Marketplace is 1 minute away. Out on the roads after 4 hours, they have wrapped up the wreck investigation that shut down northbound 45 at Parramatta. All lanes are back in business, but it will take quite some time to unwind from right around AirTags. Might want to still take the Hardy instead. Northbound 69 Southwest Freeway at last check, we still had a stall in the center lane right at the downtown spur, and westbound 290. We've got a wreck before Huffmeister in the left lane, 40-minute trip from the West Loop.
Support for Houston Public Media comes from Specs, celebrating and focusing on tequila for sipping, margaritas, and more throughout the month of May. Recipes and more at specsonline.com. The fun starts here.
Support comes from Signify Business Cash by Wells Fargo. With this business credit card, cardholders can earn rewards on business purchases with no caps or categories to track. Learn more at wellsfargo.com/Signify. Terms apply.
Support for Houston Public Media comes from Medical Bridges, where 95% of all support goes directly to humanitarian efforts. Since 1997, they've helped strengthen healthcare around the globe. More at medicalbridges.org.
Support comes from Gen Pro, a Houston-based home generator service providing power to homes during unexpected outages, helping with connectivity and productivity. More information is available at genpro.com.
Marketplace is supported by Commvault. When companies face ransomware and outages, they can recover data and business in just minutes with Commvault.
Okay, unless something really drastic happens, just this one more day of bond market stories, and then that's it. From American Public Media, this is Marketplace.
Marketplace is supported by Odoo, dedicated to providing software designed to scale with businesses. Odoo's programs for manufacturing, accounting, and more aim to provide building blocks for creating a custom software suite. Odoo, what small businesses need. And by Viking, committed to exploring the world in comfort, offering a small ship experience with a shore excursion included in every port and onboard cultural enrichment. Discover more at Viking.com. And by Gamma. Gamma uses AI to generate presentations, websites, social media, and documents from a single prompt. No design or coding skills required. More at gamma.app. You have ideas? Gamma brings them to life.
In Los Angeles, I'm Kai Rizdal. It is Thursday today, the 22nd of May. Good as always to have you along, everybody. I'm going to oversimplify here for a minute as we get going, and I hope you'll bear with me. The stock market, as we all know, is, first of all, not the economy. But also, stocks are volatile. They go up and down, seemingly without reason, and they do that a lot, especially in times of economic uncertainty, like right now. Bonds, though, are supposed to be the serious ones, the sober ones, steady, not prone to panic. And while we don't, and I want to make sure you hear me on this, we do not have panic in the bond market now, there are things happening that are worth spending some time on. And one of the big reasons that bonds are worth spending time on right now isn't because of the benchmark 10-year Treasury note, which regular listeners of this program are well acquainted with. What's interesting right now is the long bond, the U.S. 30-year, where the yield, the interest rate the government is paying, jumped above 5% this week. Marketplace's Henry Epp gets us going with the long end of the yield curve.
The longer an investor holds U.S. Treasury bonds, typically they'll want a higher interest rate because a lot can change in 10, 20, or 30 years, says Kathy Jones, chief fixed income strategist at Charles Schwab, which is a Marketplace underwriter.
Those buyers, definitely are looking at it as a riskier proposition. So 10-year, yeah, there's some risk premium in there, but not nearly as much as a 30-year.
And right now, Jones says, investors see the U.S. as an increasingly risky bet in the long term.
So anybody who's willing to buy, they want to get more yield to compensate them for the added risk.
The reason is a lack of confidence in the U.S.
Campbell Harvey is a professor of finance at Duke University. The downgrade of the country's credit rating by Moody's last week hurt that confidence. So has all the uncertainty with President Trump's trade policy. And then there's the ballooning federal debt.
There's a perception that the U.S. is not going to get its fiscal house in order.
Already, the U.S. has more than $36 trillion in debt. Add to that the tax and spending bill passed along party lines by the GOP House, and
it looks like the deficit will go up even more, leading to even higher debt.
Which would mean the federal government needs to woo even more investors to buy even more Treasury bonds. But appetite for those bonds is waning, says Chuck Tomes at Manulife Investment Management. At an auction for 20-year Treasury bonds this week,
there was less demand from end investors than usual.
Less demand for greater supply of bonds could further drive up bond yields. And those rising interest rates flow through other parts of the economy because long-term Treasury yields are closely linked to other kinds of debt, says Campbell Harvey at Duke.
For the consumer, it's the mortgage rate. And for the corporation, it's their funding rate for evaluating capital projects.
So higher long-term yields mean buying a house could get more expensive, and so could the cost of capital investments by companies. Both, Harvey says, would be bad for growth. I'm Henry App for Marketplace.
On Wall Street today, stocks, as it happens, barely budged. We will, though, of course, talk bonds as well when we do the numbers. Start this next bit off by pointing out, just so we're all clear, that we are not in a recession right now. The people who actually decide when recessions start and end, members of the Business Cycle Dating Committee of the National Bureau of Economic Research, they say they look for, and this is a quote, a significant decline in economic activity that spread across the economy and lasts more than a few months. I understand the internet might have tried to convince you otherwise. We had a conversation about that, actually, in our staff meeting the other day. Social media posts that people had seen.
Here are my recession indicators. Katy Perry going to space. Are La Boo-Boos an economic indicator for a recession?
Sinners is a recession indicator. Get
out of my
office.
Get out. So we called some actual economists to hear what they have been seeing out there.
People deciding to elope instead of having weddings.
Sale of single-serving liquor bottles, nips.
As a mom of twin 2-year-olds, the diaper rash indicator is something that we actually talked about just this weekend at a party.
That's Ethan Struby at Carleton College, Kara McDaniel at Arizona State, and Tap of the Night at Willamette University. The hard data, as we have been talking about on this program for a couple of months, shows us that right now, the economy is actually pretty healthy. The softer data, though, how people are feeling about things, tells us something completely different. Consumer sentiment, just for instance, hit a 3-year low last week. Here's Kara McDaniel.
Are you going to start talking about recession indicators when you feel really secure in your job and you feel, hopeful about the future and the economy's on the right track? Probably not.
And, says Ethan Struby,
people are looking for external validation of their vibes, right?
Right. Catch is that search for validation causes problems of its own.
If we start to believe that the economy is not going to do well and we all start to cancel our spending plans and we all start to not invest in new businesses, then that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
That's one of the reasons why economists are so hesitant to say there's a recession coming up, because we don't want to actually cause what we were afraid was going to happen anyway.
That was Tap of the Night at Willamette right there. The thing is that people, just like businesses, don't much care for uncertainty. And right now, they're just looking for some idea of what might be going to happen. Ethan Struby, one last time.
My own personal recession indicator, which has no basis in reality, is people asking me, are we in a recession right now? Nobody wants to ask an economist anything unless they think the economy's not doing well. So when I start getting this question a lot from my students or from journalists, I'm like, oh boy.
I will tell you, they ask journalists the same thing, too. You remember the Vibe session from a couple of years ago? Kyla Scanlon, occasional guest on this program, pointing out the disconnect between feelings and data. That's kind of where we are right now. And believe me, we'll tell you when it changes. National Association of Realtors said today sales of existing homes fell 2% last month compared to April a year ago. And the supply of homes for sale is up more than 20% to the highest it's been in almost 5 years. Had you been thinking then that the traditional spring home buying season would turn residential real estate around, or maybe just give it a little boost? Clearly that's not what's happening. Marketplace's Amy Scott has been watching the housing market a little more closely than usual of late.
Real estate broker Dee Chancho is showing a family of 4 a house for sale in Denver.
So girls, this would be your bath here.
There's 2 bathrooms upstairs? Yes.
The kids race to claim their would-be bedrooms.
This room is already purple.
And figure out where their mom could record her radio stories.
This could be your office. And look, there's a closet.
Yeah. Yep, this is my family. After years of following the housing market as a reporter, I'm now in the market. And what I'm seeing is playing out in much of the country. There are a lot more houses for sale. In Denver, Dee says, listings were up almost 20% in April compared to last year.
So there is a lot more to choose from. And the median price of a single-family home is only up 1%.
Dee says average annual appreciation for the area going back 30 years is 6.5%.
The fact that they've only increased 1% from this time last year is a significant slowdown for the Denver metro area.
Of course, that 1% is after double-digit price increases during the pandemic, when interest rates were low and demand to move was high. Now the average interest rate on a 30-year loan is close to 7%. And at these prices, a lot of would-be buyers just can't afford that monthly payment. Jake Krimmel is senior economist at Realtor.com. He says nationally, inventory is up about 30% from a year ago.
So what this means is that we're shifting from a market that was very much a seller's market coming out of the pandemic into something that's a little more balanced.
Krimmel chalks up the higher inventory to another factor. You've probably heard about the mortgage lock-in effect. Homeowners who borrowed or refinanced when interest rates were super low have been reluctant to move and pay today's much higher rates for a new loan. But Krimmel says that's faded somewhat over time.
Life happens, and eventually people, because of new jobs, kids, things like that, folks eventually have to go and search for a home.
And put theirs up for sale. Krimmel says there are some big regional differences. A pandemic-era building boom in states like Texas and Florida has increased the housing supply in the Sun Belt.
Meanwhile, the Northeast is still seeing really sort of tight supply, lower inventory, and faster sales. So there's definitely a divergence in what's going on in the data and also in the experiences of buyers in these 2 different types of places.
In Bloomington, Indiana, broker Juan Carlos Carrasquel says the market has been pretty flat for about a year.
I think it's cost of living in general.
Not only are prices higher, he says, that's pushed up property taxes.
We also have experienced nationwide an increase on insurance costs, so just cost of ownership has increased.
A cloud of uncertainty about where the economy is headed is also weighing on would-be buyers. Carrasquel says where the market goes from here hinges on interest rates. When they dipped closer to 6% for a brief moment back in the fall, sales picked up.
That's a very clear example of how rates made a difference for people to say, okay, let's do it now because the rates are a little bit lower.
Where interest rates are going is anyone's guess. See above regarding economic uncertainty. To my fellow home shoppers, good luck. I'm Amy Scott for Marketplace.
Here's the Marketplace macroeconomic data point of the day. It comes to us from the Census Bureau, which says the biggest cities in this country are getting even bigger. In 2023 to 24, the Census Bureau says almost every major urban center gained in population. That is, of course, quite the change from the early days of the pandemic when a lot of city folk opted for suburbs and rural areas with more open spaces. Daniel Ackerman looked into what's driving this urban rebound and what it might mean for the economy.
Cities create a disproportionate share of economic growth in the U.S., says Esteban Moro, director of the Urban Networks Lab at Northeastern University. He says nothing beats being around other people.
In terms of job creation, opportunities, innovation.
Moro says cities produce higher salaries, more startups, even more patents per capita. That's why Gianpaolo Baiocchi, director of the Urban Democracy Lab at NYU, is excited that more people are living in them.
There was this talk a few years ago that cities were going to die, and cities are back.
Their growth was fueled in large part by immigration, which Baiocchi says helps with an aging urban workforce.
It's keeping the population young, which means we can have a solid social security system, we can have a solvent Medicare and these kinds of things.
Of course, a booming urban population can lead to some growing pains.
Yeah, I mean, there's always two sides to it. I'm an economist.
Anna Scoville is with the Metro Denver Economic Development Corporation. And she says while fast growth has helped ease a labor shortage, it's exacerbated a housing one.
What we saw in previous decades, we were growing too fast and we can't keep up with the pace of household formation.
Perhaps the most dramatic example of the changing economic fortune of cities is New York. It lost more people in absolute numbers than any other during the first year of the pandemic. Then last year, it gained more than any other.
It helps significantly that New York City is growing again. That bolsters our tax base and helps make sure that our fundamentals are strong.
But, says Eli Dvorkin with the Center for an Urban Future,
without tackling that affordability challenge with major housing construction, we're not going to be able to retain the folks that are moving to New York.
Dvorkin says the urban economic engine only works when you've got the people to fuel it. I'm Daniel Ackerman for Marketplace.
Coming up.
Most reservation companies are now controlled essentially by credit card companies.
The battle for your bookings. But first, let's do the numbers. Dow Industrial's basically flat today, 41,859. The NASDAQ found 53 points in the couch cushions, about 0.3%, 18,925. S&P 500 down just 2 points, 58 and 42. Advanced Auto Parts revved up 57% the day after reporting quarterly sales that were better than expected. Turns out the company just lost less per share than analysts thought it would lose. Capitalism, am I right? The parent company of Napa Auto Parts, GPC, also rose today, but just 1.4%. O'Reilly Auto Parts, I cannot sing the jingle here. I know you're waiting for it, but I can't. Ran a little low on gas, trimming off 0.4% today. That big house tax bill that passed overnight would phase out clean energy incentives pretty quickly. Thus, Next Era Energy chopped off 6.4%. First Solar dimmed 4.3%. You're listening to Marketplace.
The Numbers is supported by Odoo.com, your entire business on one platform. Marketplace is supported by WSJ Plus, a news bundle that brings together business and finance insights from the Wall Street Journal, MarketWatch, Barron's, and Investors Business Daily, all on one platform, so readers can explore every angle. And by Commvault. Businesses can recover data as well as cloud applications and platforms after a cyber attack in just minutes with Commvault, so they can become a continuous business. And by Gamma. Gamma uses AI to generate presentations, websites, social media, and documents from a single prompt. No design or coding skills required. More at gamma.app. You have ideas? Gamma brings them to life.
At 6:48, you're listening to News 88.7. Out on the freeways, westbound 290, the wreck at Huffmeister is gone. On the South Loop 610 westbound direction, we've got a wreck in the left lane at 288. West Loop 610 northbound, a wreck in the lanes at the Southwest Freeway. And northbound 45 still trying to get back up to speed from around Greens for an earlier total closure that happened between Parramatta and Spring Cypress.
Hello, I'm Ernie Manous. On the next Hello Houston, Celestia Sherman sits down with author Greg Scheinman. He'll be discussing his book, The Midlife Male, in the latest edition of Cold Coffee.
And guest hosting, I'm Doug Miller. We'll also talk with immigration lawyer Charles Foster about self-deportation, and he'll take your calls.
And as always, we'll give you the biggest stories of the day at the top of each hour and get your thoughts at 713-440-8870. It's Hello Houston, where Houston talks. 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. here on News 88.7.
Support comes from HealthLink Advisors, helping hospitals safeguard patient care and operations against cyber attacks with documented continuity solutions. Details at healthlinkadvisors.com.
This is Marketplace. I'm Kai Risdall. We're going to dip our toe back in the housing market here for a second. Amy Scott was telling us about her own adventure in housing and the challenges of this year's spring home buying season. Lots of homes on the market, not so much buying. But there is something else going on out there as well. As Marketplace's Samantha Fields reports, even though inventory is up, a lot of people who want to buy can't afford a lot of the houses that are up for sale.
Just 5 years ago, someone making $75,000 a year could afford about half of the homes for sale around the country. Today, someone making that salary can only afford about 20% of homes.
So that's a massive difference.
Nadia Evangeline is with the National Association of Realtors, which did this study. She says that pre-COVID housing market was pretty balanced for middle-income buyers. Now, not so much.
And that's because the homes coming onto the market aren't always priced where the demand is. In fact, in many places, we're still seeing a huge mismatch between income levels and what's available to buy.
In a balanced market, households making about $100,000 a year should be able to afford 60% of homes. Today, they find less than 40% within reach. Susan Wachter at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School says this is relatively unusual for the U.S.
We're blessed in America to have a quote-unquote balanced market for many decades, different periods better or worse, but it's now clear that we're in a different housing regime.
One where supply is nowhere near meeting demand and isn't on track to catch up anytime soon. Not nationally anyway, but Wachter says,
we don't buy houses in America, we buy houses in a particular market.
And there are certain areas, namely small and mid-sized cities in the Midwest and South, where the housing market is coming back into better balance. But Lisa Sturdivant, chief economist at Bright MLS, says they're not necessarily the places people most need or want to live.
We have seen from census data and from other data that the bigger metro areas have been attracting more jobs and more people over the last year. And in the places where jobs are growing faster, where population is being attracted to, that affordability picture has not improved as much.
And she says that could become an increasingly big issue.
Those regions who want to attract jobs, want to attract workers, are going to find it's going to be harder and harder.
If there aren't places those workers can afford to live. I'm Samantha Fields for Marketplace.
Want to go out to eat nowadays, you pull out your phone, you fire up one of the two big restaurant reservation apps, and you figure out who's got a spot for you. Turns out, though, that which of those apps you use, OpenTable or Resy, kind of depends on what kind of restaurant you are trying to get into. Priya Krishna writes on food for the New York Times. Good to have you back on the program again.
Thank you for having me again.
For those unfamiliar, give us a primer, would you, on OpenTable and Resy, what the difference is and what the reputation, I suppose, is.
Sure. So OpenTable and Resy are two reservation platforms. OpenTable is far bigger than Resy. It's got about 60,000 restaurants, whereas Resy has 20,000 restaurants. And for a long time, the reputation was that Resy had kind of the cooler, hotter restaurants, and OpenTable had kind of the lower to mid-market restaurants. Or at least that was the reputation for a long time.
Right. Probably explains why I'm an OpenTable guy. But anyway, now OpenTable has decided they want those Resy, cooler, hipper restaurants. How are they going about it?
It's very simple. Cash. They are just throwing money at what it considers to be the hottest, trendiest, most popular restaurants in major dining cities.
Tell me, would you, about the Mexican restaurant you start this piece with, New Orleans Super Bowl weekend, right?
Yeah, so basically what happened was during one of the busiest times in New Orleans, which was Super Bowl weekend this past February, the owners of Acamaya, which is a really, really popular restaurant in New Orleans, realized that there had been a glitch in Resi, their reservation system, and basically they had been unable to book tables. And so on what was supposed to be the busiest weekend of the year, their books were empty. And then just as that happened, an open table employee walks into the door with a cooler of Gatorade and candy, says, "I have no agenda. Good luck for the weekend."
Wow.
And a little bit after that, that open table rep reaches out and says, "Switch to open table, set aside a few reservations for premium Visa customers, and we will give you a one-time payment." And I spoke to restaurateurs that threw out numbers ranging from 40,000 all the way up to close to six figures.
Where are they getting this money, open table?
Credit card companies. That is the simple answer. I don't think a lot of people realize that most reservation companies are now controlled essentially by credit card companies. OpenTable has a partnership with Visa, and Resi is owned by American Express.
And so what you've got is people whose business is food, restaurateurs, right, who are, food is it's like an artistic kind of thing sometimes. They're now basically the pawns in between giant credit card companies.
Exactly. And I think what it's showing is how much food and restaurants matter to credit card companies. I saw a report that said it was the #1 planned spending category for younger consumers, ages 18 to 24. So this is obviously something that credit card companies want to capture.
How do the chefs and the restaurant owners feel about this? Because it's a little bit rock and a hard place, right? You want people to come in, but you have to sort of sign up with one side or the other.
I think that most of these restaurants for the financial support at a time when ingredient and labor costs have never been higher, when the future of the economy isn't certain. Restaurants typically operate on razor-thin margins, and credit card companies, on the other hand, are these multi-billion-dollar enterprises.
And cash is good, I suppose. You are the interim restaurant critic for the New York Times.
Yes.
I don't know how the Times makes its restaurant reservations, but do you have thoughts one way or the other on open table versus Resi and how this all works out in real life?
I think the biggest takeaway for me as a diner is that I am not loyal to a reservation company. It doesn't matter to me which platform they are on. The platform for me is a merely incidental part of the experience. Do I think that all of these companies could be doing a better job to make the experience more friendly for users like me? Yes, definitely. But I feel no loyalty to one platform over the other.
One imagines these platforms will eventually merge and there will just be one option, right?
I hope not.
I'm just saying, that's the way things go. Priya Krishna at the New York Times. Priya, thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
Marketplace is supported by Viking, dedicated to bringing travelers closer to the destination. Viking offers a small ship experience with no children and no casinos. Discover more at Viking.com. And by the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, a nonpartisan organization dedicated to raising awareness and accelerating action on America's fiscal challenges to build a brighter economic future for the next generation. Learn more at pgpf.org.
This final note on the way out today, in which it turns out the Federal Reserve really is different. Late this afternoon, the Supreme Court let stand for now President Trump's firing of members of two independent federal agencies, the National Labor Relations Board and the Merit Systems Protection Board, until the case can be decided on the merits. Another federal agency, the head of which the president has threatened repeatedly to fire and which brought a lot of attention to this case? Yes, Federal Reserve, one Jerome Powell. But as predicted on this program when I talked to University of Michigan law professor Leah Littman a month or two ago, the court has made a carve-out for the central bank. Quoting the stay here, the Federal Reserve is a uniquely structured, quasi-private entity that follows in the distinct historical tradition of the first and second banks of the United States. End of quote. Seems then that the justices don't want economic calamity either. John Gordon Noy Carr, Amanda Peacher, and Stephanie Seek are the Marketplace editing staff. Amir Babawi is the managing editor. And I'm Kai Rizdal. We will see you tomorrow, everybody. This is APN.
Minute before 7 on the day before Friday, and you're listening to your NPR station, News 88.7. And on the freeways, got a couple of problems still. South Loop westbound 610 at 288. Also wrecked West Loop 610 northbound at the Southwest Freeway.
Support comes from Children's
Go
Museum of
straight on.
Houston, presenting Faithful Friends, an exhibit fostering connection, curiosity, understanding, and friendship. Families explore other cultures through the eyes of Houston kids. More at cmhouston.org.
90 degrees at the UH campus, and this weather update sponsored by Interfaith Relations and Community Partnerships, a program of Interfaith Ministries. Sunset at 8:12, patchy overnight fog, low of 75. Tomorrow's sunrise at 6:25. Mostly sunny throughout the day, high around 94. It'll feel more like 101 or 102. Again, right now it's 90 here at your NPR station, KUHF Houston News 88.7, a service of the University of Houston. And it's 7 o'clock.
I wish the courts were more deferential. I mean, a lot of these things are very narrow procedural rulings. I think that we're very early innings here on what the court is going to interpret the law to mean.
I'm Michael Barbaro. That's coming up on The Daily from the New York Times.
The Daily is supported by BetterHelp, committed to helping clients with issues ranging from relationship challenges and goal setting to grief and depression. Learn more at betterhelp.com/public. Innovative, immersive, and skillfully investigated. The Daily brings listeners today's stories as only the New York Times can report them. For more on today's episode, go to nytimes.com/thedaily.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Jack Speer. The Supreme Court, in a 6-3 decision today, has granted the Trump administration's emergency request to let him fire the heads of two independent agencies, the National Labor Relations Board and the Merit Systems Protection Board. As NPR's Nita Totenberg explains, it flies in the face of a 1935 court decision limiting presidential powers.
It all but outright reverses the unanimous decision of the court 90 years ago, holding that a president, then it was FDR, cannot fire agency leaders just because they disagree with those agency leaders' views, and because these are agencies created by Congress to be bipartisan and independent.
NPR's Nita Totenberg. The court on another matter in the split decision effectively ruled against allowing the use of government money to create the nation's first religious charter school. It's the Republican-led Senate's turn now to take the next step toward a massive tax and spending package. NPR's Claudia Grisales reports Senate Republicans face an uphill battle, taking up a plan that passed the House chamber by just one Republican vote.
Senate Republicans are already sharing plenty of skepticism about the House-approved plan key to President Trump's domestic agenda. The package would extend tax cuts passed under Trump's first term, reshape immigration policy, and could eliminate Medicaid coverage for millions. Fiscal hawks blanch at adding $3 trillion in deficit spending, while moderate Republicans say cuts to Medicaid are a red line. Senate Majority Leader John Thune will have to juggle those demands, plus Trump, who has been eager to unleash ire on any Republicans who buck the effort. The GOP hopes to get a final bill to Trump's desk this summer, a plan that includes a provision to lift the debt limit ahead of a critical deadline. Claudia Grisales, NPR News.
A panel of independent Food and Drug Administration advisors has recommended the next formula for the COVID-19 vaccines. NPR's Rob Stein has more.
After a day-long meeting, the FDA advisors unanimously recommended next fall's COVID-19 boosters target a version of the JN1 variant. The recommendation was based on data that shows that vaccines that target JN1 would protect people against the latest strains of the virus. The recommendation comes after the FDA announced a new approach for the COVID vaccines. The new strategy would likely limit the availability of the vaccines to those at highest risk, people aged 65 and older, and those with other health problems that make them vulnerable to serious COVID complications. Rob Stein, NPR News.
Stocks ended the trading session on a mixed note. The Dow was down a point. The Nasdaq closed up 53 points. The S&P 500 was down 2 points today. You're listening to NPR. Israel has opened a single land crossing into Gaza, saying it has allowed in nearly 200 aid trucks. UN says it has only been able to collect about half the amount so far for distribution. Comes after 11 weeks of total blockade aimed at pressuring Hamas, which sparked concerns of impending famine. Here's Anas Baba, more from Gaza City.
The aid that has trickled into Gaza falls far short of what's needed to feed a population of 2 million people. UN experts warn that many are facing starvation and infants have been treated for malnourishment. The aid trucks carried flour and baby food. The World Food Programme says a handful of bakeries are now operational in southern and central Gaza only, but it says far more are needed to push back hunger. Israel says it's allowing only a basic quantity of food because of the international pressure to prevent hunger. It comes as Israel has intensified its military offensive in Gaza. Some of Israel's closest allies in Europe are now calling for an end to the war and the full lifting of the blockade. Anas Baba, NPR News, Gaza City.
The cost of that old saying, a penny for your thoughts, will be going up. The U.S. Mint announcing today it made its final order of penny blanks, with plans to stop producing the coins once they run out. In February, President Trump announced he'd ordered production end of the 1 cent coin. While there are an estimated 1.14 billion pennies in circulation, many are sitting in desk drawers or coffee cans. Production of the pennies is expected to save about $56 million. Crude oil futures prices fell 37 cents a barrel to $61.20 a barrel in New York. I'm Jack Spear, NPR News.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Sony Pictures Classics, presenting Jane Austen Wrecked My Life, a romantic comedy about a woman who dreams of becoming a writer and experiencing true love while attending a Jane Austen writer's residency. Opens in select cities Friday.
From New York Times, I'm Michael Bobano.
Finding a new
This
route.
is The Daily. A few days ago in Rome, Vice President J.D. Vance met with the new Pope. And then he sat down with my colleague, Ross Douthat, a Times opinion columnist, for an interview about faith, immigration, the law, and the partisan temptation to go too far. Today, Ross talks us through their conversation. It's Thursday, May 22nd. Ross, thank you for being here. Just to start, tell us how this interview, which required you to leave the country and lose a lot of sleep, how it came about.
Well, so like a number of people in journalism, I have known J.D. Vance, the vice president, since long before he became the vice president. And through that connection, I convinced him to grant me an extended interview just before he became Donald Trump's vice presidential nominee. And he very graciously suggested that maybe I would like to come to Rome, where he was leading the U.S. delegation to the inaugural Mass of Pope Leo XIV, who was, of course, the first American Pope. And he basically said, why don't you come to Rome and you can interview me there? And the vice president had a private audience with Pope Leo himself, and then came directly from that to our interview.
Good to see you. Good to see you. Hey, guys, how are you?
And just to explain, Ross, we're going to be playing large segments of your conversation with Vance in this episode because it really helps you understand how Vance thinks.
Well, the ultimate goal for the conversation is to get a frank assessment from the vice president of what the administration is actually trying to do on some of its most controversial policies, most notably immigration. And there is this striking tension between where the Vatican, the Catholic bishops, the last pope, probably the new pope, tend to stand on immigration and Trump administration policy and generally the sort of populist attitude towards immigration in America and Europe.
And briefly, what exactly is the Pope and the Catholic Church's view on immigration?
So the Catholic Church does not have a formal dogmatic stance on here's how many immigrants a just society has to admit and here's how many you're allowed to deport or anything like that, right? But the positions taken by Pope Francis and so on, the church tends to be more critical of politicians who emphasize border security and tends to stress pretty intensely the rights and dignity of migrants and their right to fair treatment. So that's where we started, with the vice president's own Catholicism and then the always interesting and difficult relationship between American Catholic politicians and popes and the teachings of the church.
I think there are sort of three ways of thinking about it, and I tend to fall in the middle. Okay, so way number one, and you see some Catholics or some Christians say this, is they'll say, well, politics is politics, policy is policy, religion is religion, and, we wish the Pope all his best, or we wish the church all its best in its moral teachings, but we got to focus on policy, and these are two totally separate matters. But I think that's wrong, because it understates the way in which all of us are informed by our moral and religious values. So that's not the right way to do it. I think another way to do it would be to say, I'm just going to do everything the Holy Father tells me to do. And I think that would be a violation of the U.S. Constitution. But certainly, I think just my obligation more broadly as a vice president to serve the American people, you've got to think about this stuff. But I think the way that I take it is, on the migration question in particular, you have to think about what they've said. And when the church says, yes, we respect the right of a country to enforce its borders, you also have to respect the rights of migrants, the dignity of migrants, when you think about questions like deportation and so forth. And so you have to be able to hold two ideas in your head at the same time. And I'm not saying I'm always perfect at it, but I at least try to think about, okay, there are obligations that we have to people who in some ways are fleeing violence or at least fleeing poverty. I also have a very sacred obligation, I think, to enforce the laws and to promote the common good of my own country, defined as the people with the legal right to be here. I've talked to a lot of cardinals here in Rome, and one of the arguments that I've made, very very respectfully, I've had a lot of good, respectful conversations, including with cardinals who very strongly disagree with my views on migration, is that it's easy to get locked in sort of a left versus right. The left respects the dignity of migrants. The right is motivated by hatred. I think far too many people, obviously that's not my view, but I think some liberal immigration advocates get locked in that view, that the only reason why J.D. Vance wants to enforce the borders more stridently is because he's motivated by some kind of hatred or some kind of grievance. And the point that I've tried to make is, I think a lot about this question of social cohesion in the United States. I think about how do we form the kind of society, again, where people can raise families, where people join in institutions together, where, what I think Burke would have called the mediating layers of society are actually healthy and vibrant. And I do think that those who care about what might be called the common good, they sometimes underweight how destructive to the common good immigration at the levels and at the pace that we've seen over the last few years.
And at that point, Ross, you ask the vice president how it is he measures whether or not the administration's immigration policies are actually working. And he specifically points to two obstacles: a lack of resources for enforcement, and then what he interprets as interference from the courts.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, look, and I'm sure that New York Times listeners are going to be scandalized by this line of argumentation, but I think it's really important that in some ways the deportation infrastructure that is developed in the United States is not adequate to the task, given what Joe Biden left us. Now, there are different estimates here of how many illegal immigrants came in under the Biden administration. Was it 12 million? Was it 20 million?
Right. And we have a back and forth about this numbers specifically, but it is absolutely the case that an unprecedented number of illegal immigrants did enter the U.S. under the Biden administration that the Trump administration inherited. And it did run, I think, very explicitly on a promise to deport a substantial number of those new arrivals, and has, I think, can reasonably say it has a political mandate to do so. So the question is, how?
There are two things that we can do. I think one thing is a little bit easier and one thing is a little bit harder. And the first thing is you just have to have the actual law enforcement infrastructure to make this possible. And again, I think that we should treat people humanely. I think we have an obligation to treat people humanely. But I do think that a lot of these illegal immigrants have to go back to where they came from. And that requires more law enforcement officers. It requires more beds at deportation facilities. It just requires more of the basic nuts and bolts of how you run a law enforcement regime in the context of deportation. And that's one of the main things in the big, beautiful bill that is moving through Congress right now is more money for immigration enforcement. That's what that money is for, to facilitate that deportation infrastructure. There's a much more difficult question. And I think you see the president's frustration. I've obviously expressed public frustration on this, which is, yes, illegal immigrants, by virtue of being in the United States, are entitled to some due process, okay? But the due process...
Under a legislative to be clear,
yes,
this is based on legislation. Like, the judges who are making these decisions are not inventing this standard. It is a legislative standard.
But the amount of process that is due and how you enforce those legislative standards and how you actually bring them to bear is I think, very much an open question.
Turn right.
We'll be right back.
The Daily is supported by Total Wine and More, helping shoppers love what they find this summer season at TotalWine.com. Drink responsibly, be 21.
Get ready to turn
And by This Old House Radio Hour podcast, answering listeners' DIY and renovation questions and diving into design and building science trends. This Old House Radio Hour podcast available in podcast apps. Distribution of The Daily is made possible by American Public Media. APM produces and distributes programs that inform and inspire, entertain, and engage audiences everywhere.
This is News 88.7.
One of the biggest issues with renewable energy is that sometimes there's too much, and other times there's not enough.
So we can take the extra solar that's produced in the day and store it for use later in the evening.
On the Next Planet Money, how giant batteries are helping fix the energy grid. And on How I Built This, advice on growing a business from Caitlin Smith, founder of Simple Mills. That's on the Next Planet Money and How I Built This from NPR.
Saturday morning at 9 o'clock, right here.
Houston Public Media, in partnership with Texas Southern University, brings to you The Vibe. R&B, hip-hop, and neo-soul. Music that resonates with all ages. The Vibe on 88.7 HD3 and on the Houston Public Media app.
Support for Houston Public Media comes from Specs, celebrating and focusing on tequila for sipping, margaritas, and more throughout the month of May. Recipes and more at specsonline.com. The fun starts here.
A few days ago in Rome, Vice President J.D. Vance sat down with my colleague, Ross Douthat, a Times opinion columnist. Ross talks us through their conversation.
Okay, Ross, Vance brings up his frustration, shared no doubt by the president, with the level of due process that immigrants in the country illegally are still entitled to.
And I think that what you've seen, and I remember when I was in law school, there were all of these people who were wanting to become immigration lawyers, and there was almost a certain buzz around immigration law at the time because there was so much gray area, there was so much open space where the courts would interpret how to apply these rules. Now, in the context of the United States in 2011, 2012, 13, when I was in law school, we had significant illegal immigration, but not that much. There was this idea that you could use the asylum claim process, and you could use the refugee process, and you could use all of these other tools of the immigration enforcement regime to actually make it harder to deport illegal aliens. And then what happened is a lot of very well-funded NGOs went about the process of making it much harder to deport illegal aliens. And that's what we inherited in the year of our Lord 2025, is a whole host of legal rules, And what we're finding, of course, is that a small but substantial number of courts are just making it very, very hard for us to deport illegal aliens. And, Stephen Miller, who, of course, is sort of our immigration czar in the White House, a good friend of mine, he's thinking of all of these different and new statutory authorities, right? Because there are a lot of different statutory authorities the president has to enforce the nation's immigration laws. And there is, candidly, frustration on the White House side that we think that the law is very clear. We think the president has extraordinary plenary power. Yes, you need some process to confirm that these illegal aliens are in fact illegal aliens, and not American citizens.
Okay, but
let me just make one final sort of philosophical point here.
Mm-hmm.
I worry that unless the Supreme Court steps in here, or unless the district courts exercise a little bit more discretion, we're running into a real conflict between two important principles in the United States. Principle one, of course, is that courts interpret the law. I think principle two is that the American people decide how they're governed, right? That's the fundamental small d democratic principle that's at the heart of the American project. I think that you are seeing, and I know this is inflammatory, but I think you are seeing an effort by the courts to quite literally overturn the will of the American people. And to be clear, it's not most courts, but I think what the Supreme Court has to do, and I saw an interview with Chief Justice Roberts recently where he said the role of the court is to check the excesses of the executive. I thought that was a profoundly wrong sentiment. That's one half of his job. The other half of his job is to check the excesses of his own branch. And you cannot have a country where the American people keep on electing immigration enforcement and the courts tell the American people they're not allowed to have what they voted for. And that's where we are right now. We're going to keep working it through the immigration court process, through the Supreme Court as much as possible. And look, my hope is that when you ask what success is, success to me is not so much a number, though obviously I'd love to see the gross majority of the illegal immigrants who came in under Biden deported. That actually is a secondary metric of success. Success to me is that we have established a set of rules and principles that the courts are comfortable with and that we have the infrastructure to do that allows us to deport large numbers of illegal aliens when large numbers of illegal aliens come into the country. That to me is real success.
Mm-hmm. So there are two obvious ways that an administration frustrated by the pace of deportations could try and address those frustrations. One is to try and directly change the law that governs due process for illegal immigrants, or you could look at judicial interpretations of that law that you think have been too favorable to illegal immigrants and present test cases to the Supreme Court, a Supreme Court that is friendly to executive power, and try and get those interpretations changed. I think the administration is doing some version of both of those things, but then they also have a third track that they're pursuing.
Okay, Ross, talk about what Vance says that third option is.
So the third option, this has obviously been the zone of maximal controversy under Trump. The idea that you can claim some sort of wartime power that lets you deport illegal immigrants either without any due process at all or with a kind of extremely minimal due process. So it's sort of like the Trump administration is looking for a kind of wartime powers hack, one neat trick in a law from the 1790s that would let us avoid having to go through all the trouble of passing new legislation or establishing new Supreme Court precedents. So I asked him about that. The legal authorities that you guys have tried to use have been, the particular one is the Alien Enemies Act, right? Which is an extremely aggressive claim about wartime powers that, as far as I can tell, even under the most aggressive interpretation, is likely to apply only to an incredibly small number of migrants, right? The claim is not actually that 5 million migrants here illegally are in a state of war against the United States. Or is that the claim?
No, it's not that 5 million are engaged in like military conflict, but that I take issue that it's an aggressive interpretation. So let me back up and take some issue with the premise. I don't think that the supposition, if you look at the history and the context of those laws, is that for something to be an invasion, you have to have like 5 million uniformed combatants. Yes, we don't have 5 million uniformed combatants. But Ross, I mean, this is where I think I have to be careful here, because some of this information, of course, is classified, but I think how to put this point. I think that the courts need to be somewhat deferential. In fact, I think the design is that they should be extremely deferential to these questions of political judgment made by the people's elected president of the United States. Because when you say, well, there aren't 5 million people who are waging war, okay, but are there thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people? And then when you take their extended family, their networks, is it much larger than that, who are quite dangerous people, who I think very intentionally came to the United States to cause violence or to at least profit from violence, and they're fine if violence is an incidental effect of it? Yeah, I do, man. And I think the people underappreciate the level of public safety stress that we're under. When the president talks about how bad crime is, it's bad. It's bad. It's worse than people appreciate. And it's not, Donald Trump. I know, most of your listeners probably hate, the president I serve under, and probably hate me. Maybe not your listeners, but a lot of New York Times readers. But
we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that question in a minute.
I would just ask them, do not filter this through I see President Trump and Vice President Vance up there, and I sort of immediately assume that they're lying to me and that they're motivated by some bad value. This is not sustainable. And it's not just sustainable like, oh, this is more immigrants than we used to have. This is a level of invasion that I think our laws, we already have laws to help us deal with. And I wish the courts were more deferential. And we're going to see, again, we're very early innings in the court process. And even, some of the worst, capital W, worst Supreme Court decisions that have been made on, the media says, oh, this is a big blow to the administration. I mean, a lot of these things are very narrow procedural rulings. I think that we're very early innings here on what the court is going to interpret the law to mean.
So, a couple times in this interview, you've said something to me to the effect of, I know New York Times readers hate me, or I know New York Times readers don't like me, and so on. So, you're going to face the voters by proxy in the midterm.
Sure.
You may face the voters personally in some future, right? But to the constituency that was pro-Trump, again, maybe it's to its own surprise, but has found itself sort of shocked at various points in the first few months. What is your pitch to them right now?
I guess my pitch to them would be, we came into the administration with what we believed was a mandate from the American people to make government more responsive to the elected will of the people and less responsive to bureaucratic intransigence. And changing that is not perfect, and I won't even say that we've gotten every decision right. And I'd ask people for patience, because we're on the inside of this. You elected us to do a job, and you get to make the judgment with the benefit of hindsight whether we were just breaking stuff or whether we were actually doing something in the service of fixing things. I promise you that I believe that we're fixing things, but ultimately the American people will be the judge of that.
I think the vice president's answer reflects a sense that I've heard from other people associated with the Trump White House, which is you expect your first 100 days to be aggressive and sometimes chaotic and sometimes experimental, and you expect to generate a certain kind of backlash if you move fast and try and do big things.
Right.
And so much about the future of this administration depends on whether it's capable of sustaining a certain kind of stability and normalcy, or whether any period of stabilization will always give way to some new wave of, let's see how far we can go.
Well, Ross, thank you very much.
You're very welcome, Michael. I really appreciate it.
The Daily is supported by Total Wine & More. This summer season, with so many bottles to choose from, Total Wine & More helps shoppers love what they find. Total Wine & More. Drink responsibly, B21. And by This Is Uncomfortable, a podcast from Marketplace hosted by Rima Crace. You can hear stories about life and how money messes with it. New episodes available wherever you get your podcasts. Distribution of The Daily is made possible by American Public Media.
The Daily is powered by the journalism of The New York Times and is distributed by APM, American Public Media. You can go deeper into the stories you hear on The Daily at nytimes.com/The Daily. That's it for The Daily. I'm Michael Robardo. See you tomorrow.
I think this is a moment for a strong, steady hand.
On the next Radio Lab,
The Secretary of Defense and former director of the CIA of the intelligence.
we talk to national security expert Leon Panetta.
We have to go after terrorists. It has to be comprehensive.
About square dancing.
It came out of nowhere.
Back to the right, don't take all night.
An American tradition or a whitewashed plot? That's on the next Radio Lab.
Saturday evening at 9 o'clock, right here on News 88.7.
Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth came into his job promising a war on wokeness and weakness in the U.S. military.
No more pronouns, no more climate change obsession, no more emergency vaccine mandates, no more dudes in dresses. We're done with that.
Hegseth has taken aim at women. He's challenged the idea that women should serve in combat roles, as they have for 10 years now. He's danced around whether women make the military less lethal, including at his Senate confirmation hearing.
Making these
Commanders meet quotas to have a certain number of female infantry officers or infantry enlisted, and that disparages those women.
Commanders do not have to meet quotas for the infantry.
Next month, he's updating the Army fitness test to make it more difficult and to make the standards the same for men and women. Coming up on Today Explained, the war over women warfighters.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Janine Hurst. The Republican-led House narrowly passed President Trump's sweeping budget bill by just one vote early this morning. The bill would extend Trump's 2017 tax cuts and add a few new ones, and also includes major spending cuts to social programs such as food assistance and Medicaid. The bill now heads to the Senate, where its passage is uncertain. NPR's Barbara Sprunt has more.
Many Republican senators have issues with it. One Republican senator told my colleague Deirdre Walsh that the House bill is, quote, a sad joke. Many senators think it was a mistake to try to put all of, President Trump's agenda into one bill.
NPR's Barbara Sprunt. The Supreme Court deadlocked 4-4 on Oklahoma's request for the creation of the country's first taxpayer-supported religious public charter school, in this case Catholic. The court issued a one-line opinion upholding the Oklahoma State Supreme Court ruling that such a school would violate both the state and U.S. constitutions. The decision means the lower court ruling blocking the measure stands. Justice Amy Coney Barrett, a Catholic with indirect ties to the school involved, recused herself from the decision. The FDA says pharmacies have to stop making alternatives to a popular weight loss drug. NPR's Sydney Lupkin has more.
The shortage of semaglutide, the active ingredient in Wegovy and Ozempic, started in 2022. It opened the door for compounding pharmacies to make cheaper alternatives, something they're allowed to do during drug shortages. But in February, the Food and Drug Administration declared the semaglutide shortage over. That means compounders will have to stop making, quote, essentially copies, according to federal law. Large-scale compounders called outsourcing facilities have to stop production today, the FDA says. Small compounding pharmacies regulated by states can now only make 4 copies a month, according to the agency. Sydney Lupkin, NPR News.
U.S. futures contracts are trading flat at this hour. You're listening to NPR News. India and Pakistan have expelled more of each other's diplomats as hostilities continue between the two countries. NPR's Dia Hadid reports the expulsions come weeks after the neighboring South Asian countries agreed to a ceasefire.
The latest tit-for-tat began when India said it was expelling a Pakistani diplomat for, quote, indulging in activities not in keeping with his official status in India. Then Pakistan announced it too was expelling an Indian diplomat. Also Monday, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi vowed Pakistan would not get water from rivers, which he said India had rights. India suspended a decades-old water treaty with Pakistan following a militant attack where gunmen killed 26 people in late April. India accuses Pakistan of being behind the attack. Pakistan says it has no connection and describes the suspension of that water treaty as an existential threat. Dia Hadid, NPR News, Mumbai.
The U.S. Mint says it's ordered its last batch of blank pennies, and when that runs out, they'll no longer make the coin. The federal government has been losing money on the 1-cent coins, which cost nearly 4 cents to make each. The phase-out is expected to save the government around $56 million a year in reduced material costs. The Treasury Department says there are about 114 billion pennies currently in circulation. I'm Janine Herbst, NPR News in Washington.
Hey, it's Francis Lamb, host of The Splendid Table. Buying and cooking seafood at home can be intimidating for a lot of people, but we've got just the fix for that. And no, you don't have to start by making friends with a fishmonger. It's coming up on The Splendid Table.
Sunday at 12 noon right here on News 88.7. Be sure to tell your smart speaker to play News 88.7.
Donations come in many forms: a monthly membership, a one-time gift, and that extra vehicle you no longer need. We take any kind of vehicle in any condition. Learn more at houstonpublicmedia.org/cars. And thank you.
From a George Floyd Third Ward mural's demolition to Whataburger's suit over onions to Sesame Street's future gaining some clarity, this week's non-expert panel weighs in on intrigues in the news on the good, the bad, and the ugly on the next Houston Matters.
Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock here on News 88.7.
You're listening to Today Explained.
I'm Noelle King. Sana Kurt is an investigative reporter at The War Horse. This is a national nonprofit newsroom that covers the military and veterans. Sana recently wrote a piece titled, "Women Have Served in Combat Roles for a Decade. The Pentagon is Reopening the Debate."
Pete Hegseth has been pretty clear that he is skeptical of women in combat.
Because I'm straight up just saying we should not have women in combat roles. It hasn't made us more effective, hasn't made us more lethal, has made fighting more complicated.
He's made statements in public, in his book, during his time on Fox News, saying that women should be able to serve in the military, but that combat roles specifically are not suited for women.
When I'm talking about that issue, it's not about the capabilities of men and women, it's about standards. Standards that we, unfortunately, over time, have seen eroded in certain duty positions, certain schools, certain places, which affects readiness, which is what I care about the most.
Hegseth has talked a lot about standards and specifically sort of how they've fallen in recent years. Grooming, like uniform standards, these little things that make the military sort of disciplined, saying they've sort of fallen by the wayside. But the big one that I think he's interested in is physical fitness standards specifically.
What are the physical fitness standards that he's referring to? What does he mean?
In general, the military branches have an annual or semi-annual physical fitness test that all service members take, sort of regardless of what you do in your day-to-day job. And that tests how in shape you are, how fit you are. And I think when he's talking about physical fitness standards, he's generally talking about those standards.
So for decades, the military I joined, there were different male and female physical standards because men and women are different, and that's understandable. But there were certain jobs, combat MOSs, that were only for men. So you had a male standard.
In March, Hegseth released 2 memos basically directing the military services, the different branches, to reevaluate their standards, to specifically look at their physical fitness standards, and in particular, how those standards relate to combat specialties or combat positions.
We're ensuring that any combat position across any of the services, and the services are evaluating that, has the same standard for men and women.
The memos said basically they should revisit how they've changed since 2015. And I think it's important to note that date is probably not random. That's the year that Secretary Ash Carter said that all jobs in the military would be open to women.
This means that as long as they qualify and meet the standards,
women will now be able to contribute to our mission in ways they could not before. They'll be allowed to drive tanks, fire mortars, and lead infantry soldiers into combat.
The Army was sort of already looking at some changes to its physical fitness test, but the newly released test seems to be in response, at least at some level, to this request or this directive by HEGSEF to reconsider physical fitness standards.
Okay, so the standards for the Army are going to change. What were they and what are they changing to?
Army's yearly or semi-yearly fitness test, it was called the Army Combat Fitness Test. They're now changing it to the Army Fitness Test. And historically, the Army Combat Fitness Test was graded on sort of a scale. So the standards were different for men and women, and they were different for younger and older people. They call it sort of age and gender norming. That's the test that the Army has been taking. There's going to be some changes to how that's scored. In general, the standards are going up just a little bit across the board. People are going to have to do more push-ups. There's some changes in some places to the timing of the run. But the big change really is for women who want to go into combat armed specialties or who are already in combat armed specialties. They're going to have to meet basically the male standard.
Okay, if I'm a literal-minded person, I might say, it makes sense to me that women should have to meet the same standards as men, especially, maybe even only if they weren't doing their jobs as well as men. So we now have some years of data on this. In those combat jobs, did we have evidence that women were not doing them as well as men, not doing them well enough?
There really hasn't been evidence. There are sort of two things I think are important to consider. One is that the Army and the military branches sort of look at or make a distinction between fitness standards and occupational standards. So while the physical fitness test for the Army, the Army Combat Fitness Test, has been gender normed and age normed, every woman who serves in a combat role has had to meet occupational standards. So basically these physical demands that the job requires, tasks that test how well you can really do the physical parts of the job. And that's gender neutral. They're graded the same for everyone. The debate over women in combat didn't come out of a vacuum. It came out of Iraq and Afghanistan, where women were doing the job alongside men in a lot of cases.
I basically got an email that was kind of mysterious and was like, can you meet these physical requirements? Do you want to deploy with a special operations unit? And I said yes. You deployed to Afghanistan and you're attached to a special operations unit. So I was attached to Special Forces Operational Detachment Alpha.
There were Lioness teams, these female engagement teams that, because of cultural reasons, would be involved in raiding and clearing houses, engaging with women. And they were exposed to a lot of the same, combat threats that men were.
I guess I'd say the thing about combat is that everyone has a role to play, but it ends up being much more than just, your assigned role. I carried ammunition, I carried extra equipment for other people.
Because technically their time on the front line didn't count as combat, they weren't getting awards, they weren't getting promotions. Being in combat counts for a lot in the Army and the Marine Corps. So it was impacting their career, it was impacting promotions, it was impacting benefits they could get after they got out of the military. And so a lot of the decision-making around women in combat was based on the fact that women were doing these jobs, they just weren't being recognized for it.
Is there anything else that the Pentagon under Pete Hegseth is doing that suggests it might want to reopen the question of whether women should be in combat?
I think that there are a number of things that are causing concern for women in the military. One is just sort of the scrubbing of Defense Department websites of accomplishments of women and other military, minority groups. But kind of more concretely, the Pentagon and the military branches have eliminated barrier analysis groups, which was really an Air Force initiative that the other services were starting to emulate, that worked on issues for women and various minority groups, saying basically, how can we remove barriers to their service? How can we make them better? How can we make them more lethal? How can we help them do their jobs better? And how do we develop body armor that fits women's bodies? Because that's been a big problem, is that small body armor, which is issued often to women, is designed for a small male body.
The bottom was so heavy, it didn't fit. It would clank up against my hips, and it would cause bruises on my ribs.
And then the Pentagon basically removed all of the members of some 40-plus defense advisory committees. There are these basically independent committees that advise the Secretary of Defense on everything from R&D to how the military handles sexual assault.
Is there any sense that Secretary of Defense Hegseth is overstepping and some of this may be relitigated later on?
I think there's a chance that it will be sort of reconsidered later on, but a lot of this really, for the most part, is the Secretary's prerogative. He can stand up or dismantle these committees. He has a lot of decision-making authority. He can direct the military branches to do X, Y, Z. I think a lot of the concerns people are having now is that these big questions, like women in combat, are going to be addressed without sort of the independent study and counsel that have historically accompanied big decisions in the military.
Pete Hegseth is an unusual choice for Secretary of Defense. He has, in some ways, I think it's fair to say, targeted women in the service. What do you hear from your sources, from your women sources in the military, about what they think of him and how they're feeling about all these proposed changes?
Hegseth and military leadership are focusing on sort of small culture wars questions rather than some of the big questions that are facing the military. And I think, one thing that I've heard is that Hegseth talks a lot about lethality and the importance of lethality, and that sort of woke, quote-unquote, woke culture in the military is undermining lethality, but they haven't really seen a definition of what lethality is. I think a lot of people in the military would like to get a clearer understanding of how he defines lethality.
She's an investigative reporter at The War Horse, which is a national nonprofit newsroom that covers the military and veterans. Find them at thewarhorse.org. Coming up, a lady veteran who did something that Secretary of Defense Hegseth couldn't.
Today Explained is supported by BetterHelp, committed to supporting mental health through therapy and helping clients find balance. Clients are matched with one of 30,000 therapists for online therapy from anywhere at betterhelp.com/public.
Today Explained is supported by Penguin Random House, presenting Strangers in the Land, Exclusion, Belonging, and the Epic Story of the Chinese in America by Michael Luo, now available wherever books are sold.
This is News 88.7.
Israel calls the death of 2 staff from their Israeli embassy in Washington an act of hatred.
We're going to overcome moral depravity of people who think that they're going to achieve political gains through murder.
Also on the roundup, inside the GOP's mega bill. And what do we know about President Trump's crypto dinner as he hosts 200 of his largest meme coin investors? That's next time on 1A.
Tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock right here on News 88.7.
What will you find in an overseas American military cemetery?
Everybody wants to be remembered somehow, some way by somebody.
Hear how the Dutch honor their liberators from the Second World War. And look at the old world as 19th century Americans first encountered it.
They would see the great cathedral of Rouen, and it just took their breath away.
It's on the next Travel with Rick Stevens.
Caution, please mind.
Saturday morning at 6 o'clock here on News 88.7.
This is Today Explained.
Ranger School is kind of a crucible event for the Army. It's a 3-phase school in which individuals are deprived of food and sleep and warmth and kind of basic human comforts and forced to make decisions and lead in complex situations, and then they're evaluated on those leadership decisions. So Ranger School was founded in 1952, and it's kind of touted as the premier leadership training and evaluation school for the Army. And women weren't given the chance to, or the opportunity to attend until 2014. So it took the Army 62 years to realize that women could be leaders too.
Emily Van Ass served in the Army for 7 years as an infantry officer. She was, in fact, in the first group of women to commission as infantry officers. That was in 2016. And she was among the first women to graduate from the Army's elite Ranger School.
I went to Ranger School on the 1st of January, 2017, and I woke up, 3 a.m. that day in Fort Benning, Georgia, shaved my head 1/4 inch all the way around, just like the men, took my last hot shower, choked down some French toast, and then I drove to Camp Rogers. And I remember being, very acutely aware of the pain that the school would inflict, both physically and mentally. But I very much considered it a prerequisite for my job as an infantry officer. I was also very aware that there was kind of half of this population of objective graders that just kind of hated my guts for even showing up.
They hated you for showing up because you're a woman?
Keep left. Back in 2016 and 2017, it was so new to have women in Ranger School. I used to think, I don't have to just be good. I have to be lucky. I have to get a grader who is willing to let a woman pass. I had dark times at that school. I tasted real failure. I sat under a poncho in torrential rain, and I shivered so hard my whole body cramped. I put on a ruck that weighed 130 pounds, and I crawled up a mountain on my hands and knees. I hallucinated a donut shop in the middle of the Appalachian Mountains, and I cried one morning when someone told me I had to get out of my sleeping bag. But I think all of those experiences are such quintessential Ranger School experiences. They're what everyone kind of goes through there. The point of the school is that failure, that suffering, it's not inherently bad, right? In a way, I like to think Ranger School was the most simplistic form of gender integration that ever could have happened, because if I was contributing to the team, there's no individual out there that really had the luxury of disliking or excluding me.
Did you only cry that one time?
I think it was just once at Ranger School, yeah.
Damn!
It was a cold morning, and I just really didn't want to get out of my... It had been 10 minutes of sleep, and I was like, no, please, 10 more minutes. But you did it. You just did it. And then you kept going.
Well, you just did it. Most of us didn't. Okay, so when you wanted to give up, I'm going on a tangent here just because I find this fascinating. I'm so sorry. I'm of the age where I was 13 when G.I. Jane came out, so yes. I just think this is so badass. When you wanted to give up, why didn't you? What did you tell yourself? Was it I'm a woman and I must prove a point? Or was it I, Emily, am certainly not going to pull out of something that I want? What was going through your head?
I don't think I ever really considered quitting at Ranger School. I just knew that it was something that I could get through and had the confidence to continue. I think I had a thought going in of what could be so bad that would make me quit, and the answer that I found throughout the school was nothing.
Did you ever feel when you were in Ranger School they had lowered the standards for you compared to the men who were alongside you?
No, never. I did the same thing that the men did. I did the same Ranger physical fitness test that all the men took. I ran 5 miles in 40 minutes. I did 49 push-ups, 59 sit-ups, 6 pull-ups. I rucked 12 miles in 3 hours with a 45-pound ruck. I climbed the same mountains. I carried the same stuff. I carried the same exact packing list they did, plus 250 tampons for some reason. At no point were the standards lowered for me.
Whose idea was it for you to carry 250 tampons? It wasn't yours.
It was not mine, yeah. A misguided effort to have everyone very prepared for the first women coming through Ranger School.
Let me ask you a question about 6 pull-ups. Were there any men who you were physically superior to? In Ranger School, were there any men who could only do 5 pull-ups? Or was it basically look, women have different levels of strength, upper body strength, and so 6 is good, but that's sort of the low point?
No, not at all. It's 6 pull-ups or you don't get to do Ranger School. You get dropped on the first day. So everybody does 6 pull-ups.
So in Ranger School, there's only one standard for the fitness test. Everybody's got to meet it.
Correct.
And that allows you to get out of Ranger School and say, look, fellas, I took the same test as the men and I passed. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth is saying that Army combat jobs should only have one standard of fitness for both men and women. And there's part of me that thinks, doesn't that allow the women who meet the standards to be like, look, we met the same standards as the men. Nothing suspicious here, guys.
I think gender-neutral standards for combat arms is very important. Like, it should not be discounted how important physical fitness is for combat arms. I think there's nuance in determining, like, what is a standard that is useful for combat arms, right? But I think it's an important thing. And there have honestly been gender-neutral standards for combat arms in things like infantry basic officer leadership course, which is kind of the initial kind of basic training for officers going into the infantry. There are gender-neutral standards that you have to meet. You have to run 5 miles in 40 minutes. You have to do a 12-mile ruck. Like, all of those standards have remained the same. Pete Hegseth is specifically referring to the Army Combat Physical Fitness Test. And to a certain extent, I agree. It should be gender neutral for combat arms, but I think there's nuance in determining what exactly does combat arms entail physically.
Secretary Hegseth has a lot to say about women, and sometimes he says it directly and sometimes he alludes to it. What he often does is he talks about lethality as something that is critically important for the military. He says the Army in particular needs more of it, but he never really defines what he means by lethality. What is the definition as you understand it?
There's a component of lethality that is physical fitness, and it should not be discounted. But lethality extends far beyond that, right? It's tactical skills, it's decision-making, it's leadership, it's grit, it's the ability to build trust and instill purpose in a group of people. It's how quick a fire team in my platoon can react to contact, how well my saw gunner can shoot, how quickly I can employ and integrate combat assets, how fast I can maneuver a squad. All of those things take physical fitness, but they certainly take more than just physical fitness. So I think there's more to lethality than just how fast you can run and how many push-ups you can do.
To your average civilian like myself, I hear lethality and I think of the dictionary definition, the ability to kill. Does this definition of lethality involve the ability both physically and emotionally and psychologically to kill another person?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so when Secretary Hegseth cast doubt on the ability of women to be as lethal as men, do you think there's some stuff baked in there that maybe gets to his idea of what women are willing and able to do?
Yeah, possibly. I think the SecDef's message is, like, pretty clear. Like, according to him, the women in combat arms achieved success because the standards were lowered for them. We were never accommodated and the standards were never lowered.
So what's your response then to hearing the Secretary of Defense say women don't belong in combat?
I mean, it makes me irate, to be honest. Like, it's just a complete discountment of all of the accomplishments of the women that came before us. There's this Rupi Kaur poem that I love, and that, like, gives me solace and strength in these moments, where it just feels like I'm having the same conversation on a repeat these days. And it goes like, I stand on the sacrifices of 1 million women before me, thinking, what can I do to make this mountain taller so the women after me can see further? It's exhausting to have this conversation again. But at least I get to relive the accomplishments of some incredible women that have added so much to that mountain.
Do you think that if Secretary Hegseth could take a look at what you did in Ranger School and he could hear from you that there were no second chances, there were no excuses, there was no babying, the men didn't treat me nicer just because I was a woman, do you think that he'd change his mind about women serving in combat?
I'd like to think he would, but I've met plenty of people whose mind couldn't be changed by reality. I'd love if he went to Ranger School. He has a lot of opinions about Ranger School for someone who's never been. He may have gone and failed. I'm actually not quite sure. But he does not have his Ranger tab.
What is a Ranger tab for civilians?
A Ranger tab is what you receive upon graduating Ranger School, which means you have passed all 3 phases, and you are now Ranger qualified in the military.
So you have that, and the Secretary of Defense doesn't.
He does not, though he has a lot of opinions about Ranger School.
We gon' ride together, fight together, that's how we get down.
Emily Van Ass She has since left the military, and today she works for a defense technology company. That song you're hearing is This Will Defend by the Army Rappers. They're part of the U.S. military. Today's episode was produced by Victoria Chamberlain with an assist from Denise Guerra. It was edited by Miranda Kennedy, fact-checked by Laura Bullard, engineered by Andrea Christenstadter and Patrick Boyd. I'm Noelle King. It's Today Explained.
Everyone's here for a purpose. I'm here representing mine. Took my passion to the armed forces. Me already gon' shine. United States defines grace. Not here to waste no time. No final place to rise in grace. This will defend or die. Let's just be honest. This country's amazing. I cannot deny.
Recently on Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me, Shantira Jackson got excited about the new American Pope.
We won something, and I'll take the gold, even if it's a chalice.
I'm Peter Sagal. This week, we see if Saturday Night Live star Ego Woda medals in our competition. Join us for the news quiz where everybody gets on the podium. That's this week's Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me from NPR.
Keep laughing.
Saturday and Sunday mornings at 10 o'clock here on News 88.7.
What you hear on this station, every report, every interview, every update, is only here because someone like you gave.
80% of Houston Public Media's funding comes from Houstonians like you. Our newsroom runs on support from you, our community.
You have the right to know what's going on, and you have the power to make sure others do too.
Join the community right now at houstonpublicmedia.org/donate or call 888-909-0887.
Well, tonight we'll have increasing cloud cover with a low around 76 degrees and southeast wind 5 to 10 miles per hour. Tomorrow, Friday, patchy fog before 10 a.m. Otherwise, mostly sunny with a high near 94 degrees. Heat index value 103. Friday night, increasing clouds with a low around 76 degrees. Saturday, mostly sunny with a high near 92 and a heat index value of 102. This is your NPR station, KUHF Houston News 88.7, a service of the University of Houston.
Welcome to The Middle, a weekly show that elevates the voices of Americans who are so important politically but are often left out of our national conversation. Americans in the Middle. I'm Jeremy Hobson. One of President Trump's first executive orders was to rid the federal government of all diversity, equity, and inclusion programs and policies. He's also put pressure on private companies to do the same, and many have. A sharp turn from the movement that followed the murder of George Floyd and that many Americans feel went too far. So if not DEI, then what can be done to ensure equal opportunity for all Americans and to reckon with the past? We're taking your calls live at 844-4-MIDDLE. That's 844-464-3353. Joining us, ACLU President Deborah Archer, author of Dividing Lines, and Camille Foster, editor-at-large at Tangle News. Stay right there. The Middle starts right after the news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Jack Spear. An independent federal watchdog agency ruled today the Trump administration has violated the law by improperly freezing funds for an electric vehicle program. NPR's Chris Arnold reports at issue is the Impoundment Control Act that stops a president from withholding funds already approved by Congress.
The Government Accountability Office has at least 39 investigations into possible violations of the act by the Trump administration. This one involves $5 billion already allocated to build electric vehicle charging stations across the country. The GAO finds that the administration has been improperly freezing the money and must continue to carry out the program. The GAO also has the power to file a lawsuit. There are already other lawsuits underway over the allegedly illegal freezing of such funds. The White House has argued that the Impoundment Control Act is unconstitutional, but GAO points out that the Constitution specifically gives Congress the power of the purse. Chris Arnold, NPR News.
A Chicago man is facing federal charges for the killing of 2 Israeli embassy staffers in Washington. Federal prosecutors announced today charges less than 24 hours after Yaron Lashinsky and Sarah Milgram were gunned down outside a Jewish museum. NPR's Ryan Lucas has more.
Elias Rodriguez faces several charges, including first-degree murder, murder of a foreign official, as well as several gun charges. The interim U.S. Attorney for Washington, D.C., Jeanine Pirro, called the shooting horrific and said her office will not tolerate such crimes.
We're going to continue to investigate this as a hate crime and a crime of terrorism.
and we will add additional charges as the evidence warrants.
Officials say they believe Rodriguez acted on his own. According to court documents, he arrived in Washington, D.C. from Chicago on Tuesday, the day before the shooting. He allegedly told police after his arrest that he did it for Palestine and for Gaza. Ryan Lucas, NPR News, Washington.
The Trump administration is restoring in-person training at the National Fire Academy in Maryland after abruptly pausing it in March. As NPR's Frank Langford reports from Washington, the reversal today came after the Trump-supporting firefighters publicly criticized the move.
The administration initially paused in-person classes, saying they weren't mission critical. But now it says a comprehensive review found certain courses were, quote, effective. John Beck runs the Waynesboro Volunteer Fire Department in Pennsylvania.
We're getting back on track with the training that should have never been taken offline. But this is good news because this is exactly what the public deserves.
Each year, the Academy trains thousands of fire chiefs on everything from leadership to how to conduct fire and arson investigations. A source familiar with the process said the administration's handling of the Academy fits a broader haphazard approach to cuts and funding freezes. Frank Langford, NPR News, Washington.
You're listening to NPR. The Trump administration has revoked Harvard University's ability to enroll international students under the authority of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Details were sent in a letter to the school. The changes impact currently enrolled international students. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem in the letter accused the university of fostering anti-Semitism and collaborating with China's Communist Party. Harvard, for its part, issued a statement calling the action illegal. Harvard has nearly 7,000 international students, making up about 27% of the student body. The company behind the artificial intelligence chatbot ChatGPT is joining forces with one of the best-known designers in Silicon Valley to make AI-enabled devices. Here's NPR's John Ruwitch.
OpenAI says it's buying a startup called I.O. for about $6.5 billion. I.O. was launched last year by the designer Johnny Ive, who created the iPhone and other iconic products for Apple. The tie-up deal links the legendary designer with Sam Altman, OpenAI's CEO and one of the driving forces behind the explosive growth of AI in recent years. The goal, they say, is to create AI-powered devices. OpenAI declined to say what exactly those devices would be. Companies are scrambling to create devices like glasses or robots that can sense the real world and analyze and interact with it using artificial intelligence. Altman previously invested in a company that attempted to make AI-enabled lapel pins about the size of an Apple Watch. John Ruwitch, NPR News.
Stocks ended the session on a mixed note. The Dow was down 1 point to 41,859. The Nasdaq closed up 53 points. The S&P 500 was down 2 points today. I'm Jack Speer, NPR News in Washington.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include the Walton Family Foundation, working to create access to opportunity for people and communities by tackling tough social and environmental problems. More information is at waltonfamilyfoundation.org.
Get ready.
Welcome to The Middle. I'm Jeremy Hobson, along with our house DJ, Tolliver, who is actually a DJ on the radio version of this show, but not on the podcast because we don't have the rights to play the music on the podcast. And so I feel like I have to occasionally remind listeners of that, Tolliver, in case they're wondering what it is that you do here.
I told him I'll make a brand new soundtrack for The Middle. Okay, don't play with me. I'll come in.
Then we would have the rights. Okay,
exactly.
So this hour we are jumping into the deep end with a topic that can be tricky to talk about, and that is DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. It has been almost 5 years to the day since the murder of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer, an event that shocked the world and led to widespread protests about racial justice and reckoning in America. On an institutional level, one of the biggest efforts we saw to acknowledge this was the implementation of DEI measures across all levels of business, education, and government. And while these efforts were designed with racial healing in mind, they became divisive for some, with DEI effectively turning into a dirty word for some Americans. One of President Trump's first executive orders banned it from federal programs and policies, and the president has pressured private companies to do the same, and many of them have. So our question is, if not DEI, then what can be done to reckon with injustices of the past and ensure equal opportunity for all Americans? We're taking your calls in a moment at 844-4MIDDLE. That is 844-464-3355.